So I'm Julian Squires, Regional Manager of the Lighthouse Safeguarding Unit at Avon and Somerset Police. And my unit covers the south of our constabulary area, which is Somerset and North Somerset. And I'm here today to just talk to you a little bit about our unit and how we are set up and in the way that we are and the work that we cover. Avon and Somerset Police's approach to safeguarding and victim care is unique among police forces in the country. There is no other police force that's currently set up in the way that we are set up to manage situations relating to safeguarding and vulnerability and also victim care. The Lighthouse Safeguarding Unit provides police representation at safeguarding multi-agency safeguarding processes. So that's primarily strategy and MASH and MARAC processes, which I'll come to in a little more detail shortly. But alongside that, we also provide victim care services to people within our communities who are victims and witnesses of crimes. And the reason we are set up in the way that we are is fundamentally resulting from that question that's on the screen now, which is vulnerability and what it is. Prior to 2018, our safeguarding and victim care services were set up separately, and there was a great deal of responsibility placed on frontline officers, so primarily from our response and our neighbourhood teams, to understand the nuances between statutory safeguarding responsibilities and those which are not covered in statute, but do relate to people who have clear vulnerabilities and therefore who are in need of police support. As a result, the text in bold there is the definition that the constabulary uses to define vulnerability. So we now consider that anyone who has been or is believed to be at risk of harm, abuse, or exploitation following consideration of their individual circumstances and who is or may be in need of support or intervention is vulnerable, but alongside that, it is any victim of crime who's entitled to an enhanced service in accordance with VCOP, which is the Victims Code of Practice. Now, in longer sessions, we could dive into this in a bit more detail, but essentially that definition is alluding to those within our communities who require statutory for whom there is a statutory responsibility to safeguard. So primarily we're thinking about those who are covered by the Children's Act of 1989 or the Care Act of 2014 for adults, those who have care and support needs or who are children. But alongside that, the Victims Code of Practice is a piece of statutory guidance. So it's not legislation in its own right, but it's statutory guidance which outlines what people who are victims of crime can expect from the police in terms of service level. So we're thinking about people who are victims of domestic abuse, sexual offences, violent offences, antisocial behaviour, hate crime, and many, many more. Prior to 2018, our frontline officers were expected to understand which part of the organisation should be providing responses or support to people affected variously by those areas covered by the Victims Code of Practice and those who have a statutory need that requires a safeguarding response. And the reality was that we weren't very good at it, and that we spent a lot of time duplicating our efforts to try and work with these situations. The merger of the two units, the Lighthouse Victim Care Unit and the Safeguarding Unit, resulted in us taking responsibility away from our frontline officers to make that decision, and actually just to ask our officers to recognise any sort of vulnerability, to send it to the LSU, and we now have internal processes which determine whether we require a sort of statutory safeguarding response, which means potentially just information sharing or something more formal, or whether we are providing a victim care response. Our safeguarding overview: we are responsible for the oversight of child protection and vulnerable adult incidents which are reported to the police, and we represent the constabulary at strategy meetings, MASH meetings in all 5 local authority areas. We also have MARAC processes in all 5 local authority areas and child protection case conference as well. Alongside that, we have dedicated case conference and missing person teams who deal with matters relating to children who are considered through CP processes, and also who work with partner agencies around children who are frequently reported as missing. Alongside that, we also work with children's and adult social care to reduce risk, problem solve, and support vulnerable people. On the safeguarding side of our operation, we have no direct contact with victims. Okay, we are responsible for liaison with partner agencies and other professionals to problem solve and develop plans to safeguard the vulnerable. And we're also have a remit to provide advice and guidance to other members of staff and officers across the organisation who require advice and guidance around safeguarding matters. Our victim care wing, our victims hub, is responsible for dealing with victims of crime and supporting them from the moment of reporting through to the conclusion of any criminal justice process. Around about 60% of everything that our victim care sites deal with is domestic abuse or is related to domestic abuse. And they are responsible for both the pre-charge and the post-charge support for victims of domestic abuse. So following a report to police and an attendance by a police officer, the incident will be referred into our unit for us to review, and if we have an incident where we are required to provide a victim service, we will contact that victim or seek to contact that victim and undertake what's called a common needs assessment. And essentially during that initial phone call, we are trying to determine the extent to which an incident has impacted on an individual so that we can discuss with them options of support and signpost to other agencies, many of which are commissioned by local authorities or by Police and Crime Commissioner, to provide specialist support to people who are affected by different incidents that have taken place. So we are not our teams are not trained therapists, and we don't provide the support themselves. Our service is about undertaking an assessment of need and ensuring that the appropriate commissioned service is signposted or referred to ensure that people can get the specialist support that they need. So we don't actually provide the therapy or the support ourselves. This is more about an assessment service that can then refer on or signpost to the most appropriate sources of support. So, I mean, we have a number of agencies that we use routinely, dependent on the situations that we are dealing with. You know, there are commissioned IDVA services across the Avon and Somerset footprint. So we're talking, you know, in Somerset we obviously have SIDAS, and I talked about, you know, roughly 60% of what we deal with is domestic abuse. So lots of conversations are around the support that SIDAS and U-Trust can provide to people who are experiencing domestic abuse. But we also have advocacy, so we work with Swan Advocacy to provide advocacy for people who we feel that need that kind of support. We have a young victim service as well. So if we are dealing with you know, with victims of crime who are children, and I should say that the Victims Code of Practice clearly states that anyone who is a victim of crime who is a child is entitled to an enhanced service from us. So, you know, even from the seemingly most trivial report of a low-level crime, we will at the very least consider a response, an appropriate response around what that might be, and that could be that we're contacting parents to try and understand the impact of that incident on the child and understand if there's a need for us to refer to the young victim service to support that recovery as well. So there are a range of services. We do have a website. There is a Lighthouse website which will talk, which will have links to the various services, but there are many, and as I say, most of them are commissioned services by local authority or by Police and Crime Commissioner. So we are you know, we are sort of governed by the commissioning arrangements in any local authority area. Alongside that, our victim care teams will consider safeguarding matters. So although they work in our Victims Hub, they do have a responsibility to recognise the impact, particularly of things like domestic abuse on children who might be resident in the home. And they will be responsible for ensuring that information is shared across the partnership accordingly. Subsequent to the pre-charge element of that work, if and when an investigation reaches a point where there is a court process it's going to follow, so we get to a point of charge, our victim care officers will support our victims and witnesses through that court process. And that will involve conversations around special measures to ensure that people who are nervous or who have an anxiety around attending court are supported as far as possible to provide the best evidence they can in a court process. So that could be via video link. It could be that there are screens placed in courts to minimise the impact or the exposure to the person who has perpetrated against them. And actually, on a more practical level, it's also about making sure that victim and witnesses simply understand where they're meant to be and when they're meant to be there, and that if they need help with travel arrangements and so on and so forth to get to these places, that we are there to support them through that, and ultimately to provide people with updates around the conclusion of court process once they reach that stage.